I produced it because I saw.
The cameras flashed, the red carpet shimmered beneath her heels, and the world watched as Angelina Jolie stepped into the spotlight once again. But behind the flawless smile and graceful posture, her heart was somewhere else, far from the awards, far from the flashing lights. That night wasn't about triumph, it was about survival. Few knew that just days before, Jolie had sat silently in a hospital room, holding the hand of the woman who once carried her through life. That woman was now slipping away, moment by moment, breath by breath. There were no reporters there, no fans, only two souls, one leaving, one learning how to stay behind. This isn't a story about fame. This is a story about the one person who mattered more to Angelina than any Oscar, any headline, any role. Her name was Marcheline Bertrand. And today we look back at a love story between mother and daughter, a story about sacrifice, illness, identity, and how the death of one woman forever shaped the soul of one of Hollywood's brightest stars.
Before the world knew her as Lara Croft, Maleficent, or the fearless envoy of the United Nations, she was simply Angelina, a quiet girl with stormy eyes and a last name she didn't want to keep. Angelina Jolie was born on June 4, 1975, in Los Angeles, California, to actor Jon Voight and actress Marcheline Bertrand. With two cinematic bloodlines, her destiny seemed etched in film reels. But destiny, as she would later discover, was never simple. Her childhood was shadowed by absence. Her father, Jon Voight, was a Hollywood icon whose own life was consumed by fame and fractured choices. Their relationship would later become strained, so much so that Angelina legally dropped the Voight from her name, choosing instead Jolie, the French word for pretty, a name she would make entirely her own. Raised primarily by her mother, Angelina grew up in modest apartments, far from the glamour of her father's world. While Marcheline quietly gave up her career to raise Angelina and her brother James Haven, her sacrifices were never framed in bitterness. Instead, they were the roots of the fierce loyalty that Angelina would carry for a lifetime. Angelina's early life was anything but conventional. She struggled with self-image, battled depression, and often felt like an outsider, even in her own skin. But acting gave her a channel. At just 16, she began working in low-budget films, slowly crafting her unique voice, a blend of raw emotion and haunting vulnerability. Her breakout came with Girl Interrupted, 1999, a performance so visceral it earned her an Academy Award and catapulted her into global stardom. From there, she conquered action films with Tomb Raider and dramas with A Mighty Heart, cementing herself not only as a screen icon, but as a symbol of fearless femininity. Yet her greatest transformation came off-screen. Inspired by her mother's compassion, Angelina entered humanitarian work with the same intensity she brought to her roles. As a UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador and later Special Envoy, she traveled to conflict zones, adopting children, advocating for refugees, and speaking before world leaders. Fame was no longer the goal. Impact was. Throughout her journey, one name remained constant behind the scenes: Marcheline. In interviews, in charity work, in parenting, Jolie always traced her strength back to the woman who had given everything without asking for applause. But life had a cruel symmetry. Just as Angelina was learning how to become the woman she admired, fate was preparing to take that woman away.
Long before the world called Angelina Jolie a warrior, there was another woman who taught her how to fight, not with fury, but with tenderness. Her name was Marcheline Bertrand. Born Marcheline Bertrand on May 9, 1950, in Blue Island, Illinois, she grew up far from Hollywood's glittering promises. Soft-spoken, yet determined, she dreamed of acting, of telling stories that mattered, of living a life filled with meaning rather than applause. She had the kind of beauty that didn't demand attention, but invited warmth. Gentle eyes, a quiet smile, a presence that made a room feel calmer just by being there. When she arrived in Los Angeles, she carried the hopes of any young artist: roles, scripts, auditions, long days, and longer nights. But then she met Jon Voight, a rising star with brilliance and complexity in equal measure. Their love began like any cinematic romance: passion, promise, a shared dream of family. In 1971, they married, and 4 years later, Angelina was born. 2 years after that, her brother James arrived. But Hollywood is not kind to fairy tales. Fame magnifies flaws, and whispers turn into headlines. Their marriage began to crack under the weight of success, rumors, infidelity. Marcheline, who believed deeply in loyalty and family, made a decision that would define her life more than any film role ever could. She walked away. She left not out of weakness, but out of strength. She traded red carpets for school lunches, film sets for bedtime stories. In a small apartment in Los Angeles, she created a world where her children never felt the absence of a father, only the presence of a mother who loved them enough for two. Angelina has described her mother not with grand adjectives, but with moments: quiet mornings, warm breakfasts, trips to the park, nights watching old films together, where Marcheline whispered, "Art should make you feel, not pretend." When Angelina doubted herself, her mother didn't lecture. She listened. She believed in imagination, curiosity, kindness. She taught her daughter that strength didn't need to roar. Sometimes it simply needed to stay. Marcheline didn't want Angelina or James to grow up resenting the world or their father. She carried her own pain gracefully, shielding her children from bitterness. Yet the absence lingered, shaping Angelina in ways only time would reveal. She saw her mother's sacrifices, the plans she put aside, the dreams she folded away to raise two children alone. And in seeing that sacrifice, Angelina learned love in its purest form, most unselfish. When Angelina landed her first roles, Marcheline was always in the background, not pushing, not controlling, just supporting. She drove her daughter to classes, waited outside auditions, and whispered prayers in car seats outside studio gates. She watched her little girl grow into a young woman hungry for life, intense, brave, sometimes reckless, and she understood her. The world might have seen volatility. Marcheline saw spirit. There is a story Angelina once told. When she was a teenager and questioned whether she was enough, beautiful enough, talented enough, worthy enough, her mother simply held her face and said, "You are exactly who you are meant to be. The world will see it one day." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't poetic. But for a girl searching for identity, it was everything. Even when Marcheline could have returned to acting, she didn't. She chose motherhood. She chose presence. She chose love. And in doing so, she shaped a daughter who would later say, "My mother was the most gracious person I ever met. She was elegance without needing to prove it." But life, like a film with a cruel script, had a twist waiting. In her late 40s, Marcheline began feeling tired more often. Small aches, doctor's visits, she brushed them aside. She still smiled, still cooked, still kissed her children on the forehead when they visited. But the shadows grew. The rest she needed became longer. And every time Angelina asked if she was all right, Marcheline answered the same 3 words: "I'm just tired." She wasn't tired. She was sick, and a storm was coming, one that love alone could not stop.
It started with whispers inside the body, quiet, invisible, deadly. By the early 2000s, Marcheline Bertrand had begun a private battle. First, it was ovarian cancer. Then, not long after, breast cancer. 2 illnesses that stalked her silently, both carrying devastating implications, not just for her, but for her daughter. Marcheline didn't tell the world. That wasn't her way. She didn't want pity. She didn't want press. She just wanted time. Time to see her children thrive. Time to share quiet mornings with Angelina. Time to be there, just a little longer. She underwent treatments discreetly, visited doctors behind closed doors, and when her hair began to thin, she wore scarves with grace. But the pain behind her eyes, that was harder to hide. Angelina, by then, was already a global star. But even the brightest lights couldn't prepare her for the darkness that was coming. She knew her mother was unwell, but not how serious. Marcheline always smiled, always said, "I'm okay, darling." Then came the hospital stays. Longer, more frequent. Angelina canceled interviews. She stopped taking scripts. Paparazzi speculated, but behind those headlines, a daughter sat beside her mother's hospital bed, listening to the beeps of machines and counting breaths like prayers. The decline came quickly. 1 week, Marcheline was still walking, still trying to cook dinner. The next, she couldn't leave the bed. Doctors spoke in soft tones. Stage 4. Nothing more to do. Angelina didn't cry in front of them. She waited until the hallway, alone, pressed against the white walls that suddenly felt like tombs. She had seen death on film, had portrayed it with tears and fire, but this was the slow erasure of her world. In the final days, Angelina barely left her mother's side. She held her hand, brushed her hair, whispered stories from childhood, hoping, foolishly, that love could be louder than cancer. She told her, "You were everything good in me. I don't know how to breathe without you." On January 27, 2007, Marcheline Bertrand passed away at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. She was only 56. Angelina was there when it happened. The room was still. No dramatic moment, no last gasp, just silence. A kind of silence that echoes through the soul, forever. Later, Angelina would reveal the inherited mutation, BRCA1, that contributed to her mother's illness. It was a ticking clock inside her own body, a brutal inheritance. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The woman who had been her anchor, her shield, her quiet light, was gone. "I lost my mother," Angelina would say later, "and with her, I lost a part of myself." She walked out of that hospital changed. Not just a daughter in mourning, but a woman facing her own future with new eyes and deep, bone-cutting grief.
It was a gray January afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind where the sky feels too heavy and the air too still, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Marcheline Bertrand's funeral was not a Hollywood spectacle. There were no red carpets, no flashing lights, just a quiet, private gathering of those who loved her most: family,
a few close friends, and the children who had always been the center of her universe. Held at the chapel near the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, the room was modest in size but full of emotion. White lilies lined the front pews, their scent mingling with the soft hum of hymns that played from hidden speakers. A large black-and-white portrait of Marcheline sat atop the closed casket, her face serene, her smile timeless. She looked as if she might stand up at any moment and embrace the room with her quiet warmth. Angelina arrived wearing no jewelry, no makeup, no designer glamour, just a long black dress, simple, elegant, and a silk scarf her mother had given her years ago. It was wrapped gently around her wrist, like a promise. She didn't speak as she entered. She moved like a shadow, composed but hollow-eyed. Her brother, James Haven, stood beside her, hands clenched. Together they approached the casket slowly, each step heavier than the last. When they reached the front, James placed a single gardenia, Marcheline's favorite, beside the portrait. Angelina placed a folded letter underneath it. No one knows what it said. She never spoke of it again. Among the mourners were a few familiar faces from the industry, people who had known Marcheline in her early acting days, who remembered her gentleness and her fierce loyalty. But this wasn't about them. This was a farewell between a mother and the children she had given her life to. As the priest began to speak, Angelina sat motionless, eyes fixed forward, her hand occasionally gripping James's for strength. The priest spoke not of fame or loss, but of love, of a woman who gave everything she had to her children, of quiet bravery, of invisible strength. At one point during the service, a soft slideshow of family photos began to play. Images flickered across a screen. Young Marcheline holding baby Angelina, birthday parties in small apartments, snapshots of sunlit afternoons in the garden. With each frame, the quiet in the room deepened, as if each memory was too sacred for sound. When the final bell rang and it was time to say goodbye, Angelina rose slowly. She approached the casket, placed both hands on the smooth wood, and closed her eyes. No tears, just silence. Then a whisper, so soft only those nearest could hear. "Thank you for being my mother, for never letting me fall." The moment felt frozen in time. Outside, the city carried on. Cars passed, children laughed, life continued. But for Angelina Jolie, everything had changed. The woman who had held her through storms, stood quietly behind every triumph, and never once asked for credit, was now gone. And all that remained was a letter, a memory, and the long journey of mourning that lay ahead.
Grief doesn't announce itself. It lingers, silent, patient, ever present. For Angelina Jolie, losing her mother wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a fracture in her identity. In the months following Marcheline's death, Angelina retreated from the spotlight. She kept her interviews brief, her public appearances minimal. When she did speak, it was with a softer tone, a slower pace, as if part of her voice had been buried along with her mother. Friends say she spent long hours at home, surrounded by her children, flipping through old photo albums and listening to French music, Marcheline's favorite. Others remember her lighting candles in the evening, sometimes whispering into the dark, as if still having conversations no one else could hear. But grief also became fuel. Marcheline's battle with cancer, and her quiet strength through it, became a turning point for Angelina.
She underwent genetic testing and discovered she carried the BRCA1 mutation, the same hereditary flaw that had likely contributed to her mother's illness. Faced with this knowledge, she made a decision that shocked the world. In 2013, Angelina Jolie publicly revealed she had undergone a preventative double mastectomy. Later, she also had her ovaries and fallopian tubes removed. The announcement, published as an op-ed in the New York Times, was not just medical, it was emotional. A daughter speaking for the mother who could no longer speak. She wrote, "I carry a faulty gene, and I watched my mother die from it." That moment changed the global conversation around women's health. Suddenly, preventative care, genetic risk, and proactive decisions became part of public discourse because a woman brave enough to show her pain refused to let it stay silent. Angelina's humanitarian work also deepened. She poured herself into advocacy, especially for women, children, and those affected by war or illness. In every speech, in every mission, you could feel it. A daughter still honoring the grace of the woman who raised her. She once said, "Everything I do now, I do thinking of her." Grief may have broken her, but love, that fierce, enduring, mother-shaped love, gave her the strength to rebuild.
There are losses the world can see, and others that live quietly, beneath the surface. For Angelina Jolie, the death of her mother was both a public goodbye and a private unraveling. But it also became something else, a legacy. Not in the form of red carpets or applause, but in the quiet ways a mother shapes her child, in the courage to speak truth, in the strength to heal, in the grace to carry pain and still love fiercely. Marcheline Bertrand never asked for recognition. She lived in the background, loved in silence, and left without fanfare. But in Angelina, she never truly left. Because sometimes, the greatest light comes not from the spotlight, but from the shadow of a mother's love. And you? Have you ever realized how deeply a parent's presence or absence has shaped the person you are today? Tell us below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Hollywood Bloodline, where behind every star, we uncover the soul that shaped them.